Good morning.
Good morning. Oops. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Yeah. How about you? How is weather there?
Pretty cold for me right now, at least. Uh, no, seems standard. Haven't been outside in my bunker. Uh, is there something going on up there?
Uh, yeah, I mean, since last couple of days it's been really cloudy for after a very long time, so I am liking it. Right now it's like you can see half the sky and then half is covered with clouds, so it's
Uh,
really yeah.
you ever see there's a Portlandia sketch where they're like chasing after the one patch of sunshine as it moves across the field?
Yeah, I haven't noticed something like that. Uh, yeah.
Hey, Rita.
But
Hey,
all in all, it's beautiful morning right now. So I'm loving it.
And I see a Dale here. Hello, Dale.
Hey, how's it going?
Not bad. How are you?
Good.
Good, good.
Hello,
Hello, how are you?
doing good.
Good. Is it your first time, Dale? I'm sorry if I just, am forgetting.
No, I've come a couple times. And actually, I think it was a couple weeks ago, you noticed I was on and then my internet just like completely died. So,
Oh, no. And Murphy's Law.
yeah, exactly.
well, welcome again.
Thank you.
My cats are having a slap fight slash wrestle. Well, did we want to get started? Hey, Sudesh.
Hello, good morning.
Oh. Let's do it.
I had one agenda item in the meeting notes. Somebody opened the PR to create a chart for all the policies.
Yeah, and the question is whether
Yeah, do we want this or not?
I wish Andrew were here for
Yeah, I was
this.
thinking the same. Yeah.
Do we want to defer to next week? We could get some like starting thoughts. I could let him know it's on the docket and see if he is here. Copy link address. There we are. It looks like he might not be around right now. Yeah. Yeah, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think at a minimum it would need to be like auto-generated from our existing stuff. There is some logic to it, but I haven't dug too deeply about it. And I think, yeah, some of the like the mutation ones, I don't know if you want to be prescriptive with the chart because the values are clearly they're not like a one size fits all. So I think this makes sense for like the pod security or the standards, like PSS stuff, like the buckets, right? The hey, I want like the restricted or whatever it's called, I forgot now. So that in that sense, I think that could work because that's more like guided thing, but as like a one size fits all thing, it's I think harder.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of dynamics to this. I'm just looking through the specifics now. Like I was just thinking about like Helm chart at all, but yeah, the shape of it is interesting. One thing is it's nice if users can control which constraint templates get onto the cluster, just because there is overhead associated with stale, or not stale, vestigial, there we are, constraints, or constraint templates. Just the API server having to have that extra unused API surface. Things that are like, yeah, I do remember it including mutation resources. I'm trying to actually see the values here. I do not think we want to have like actual concrete constraints in here necessarily, or concrete mutators. It does look like this also sort of like translates the constraint into a like a set of parameter values for the Helm chart, right? Like the parameters of the constraint become parameter values, which could be interesting. Hopefully, it also does match selection. I haven't, as I said, looked through all of this. I'm curious as to the use of it, right? Like, is it merely to have a chart, or is this filling a specific gap, right? Like, but for a Helm chart, certain automation flows don't work. And definitely with you on the automation bit. Do any of those, they're more observations than opinions, anything spark anyone's thoughts?
I have a question actually. So this Helm chart will essentially install all the templates, right? Like validation and mutation. Like, do we want that, or rather, any user would want to install everything all at once? I mean,
Yeah,
in
so it
my
looks like
mind,
they're disabled by default, and then you choose to install whichever you want. This is how it's written today.
okay. I see.
And that kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier with the PSS. It could be more opinionated, but those are like more like specific guidance.
That makes sense.
And the other thing that the author said, it would be better to have the Helm charts as the source of truth than generate customized templates from them. I think our source of truth is the Rego, so we can unit test.
Yeah, I don't think we want the source of truth to be the Rego long term because of validating admission policy, right? Like Gator, the test suites, sort of one of the things we're laying the groundwork for there was you could have the constraint template be the like unit of code, and then you could have test objects, right, and expectations based on the inbound objects, and hopefully decouple the test from the language, so that we could do something like take something written in Rego, migrate it to validating admission policy, and be sure it has kind of the same behavior over time. Does that make sense?
We would not have the unit tests after that. If you
correct, yeah,
rely on yeah, and I'm talking about the just Rego policies, not cell.
Was it?
I'm just talking about the Rego policies, not cell.
Right. Well, the question would be, how many of these policies would be Rego after a migration to VAP? I don't think zero, right? But I do think the minority, because we probably do want to be compatible with VAP admission, and we just can't do that with Rego currently. Yeah, so it's
other aspect would be to like we would probably still need to support the Rego policies at a point in time.
Yeah, like I don't think we would kill Rego, right? I think it's just, you support both. But for a lot of the stuff that has like Rego tests, a lot of those probably will be migrated to cell, right? Like basically anything that could be expressed in VAP friendly language probably should be. And then anything that is referential, right, that will stay Rego for now. Anything that is too complex, right? So I think there's built-in unit conversion functions, for example, in VAP, but if there weren't, there'd be no way to express things like requiring using under a certain amount of RAM, except using Rego, right? So that would be an example of a template that where the underlying language, the complexity requirements of the template mean the underlying language would have needed to have been Rego. Yeah, sorry, looking at Alex's comment about what is the value prop of using Helm to install the Gatekeeper library beyond preference. Yeah, I'm not clear on that either. It also seems like there's a bit of an like transparent adapter kind of mechanism going on, right? Like, wait, are they even? Yeah, okay. Like allowed host paths, for instance. I'm looking at the validation PSP host file system constraint chart, and yeah, it looks like they're taking the parameters and turning them straight into chart values, and that's how you would customize the parameters to a constraint. Customize with a C, not a K.
And the other thing that I fear with the Helm chart is that people are going to just add just more values and stuff, like the gatekeeper Helm charts, because it's just there's just a lot of customization.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the surface here is less, right? Because a template is either installed or it isn't. A constraint is either installed or it isn't. There's some uncovered surface here to be sure. Like, what if you want multiple copies of the same constraint? I don't think the way this is written is currently amenable to that, right? So that would probably need to change, because people are probably not just going to want one set of, say, pod security standards implementations, right? Like people tend to have different thresholds for different namespaces, which implies having more than one constraint. Can this be in contrib instead of gatekeeper library? Yeah, I mean, anything can be in contrib, right? Do we have any standards for what's in contrib? Is there anything that wouldn't go in contrib? Is that another thing?
I think if it's OPA related, it can go into
Yeah,
contrib.
can just be random stuff. But I swear I thought we talked about something like this before. I mean, I see the value of it, but I just don't know if it's something that Gatekeeper Library wants to continue to maintain. Because once it's in the repo, there is like expectation that you continue to keep it up to date, right?
Yeah.
And though I see the value, I just don't know if it's necessarily how everybody wants to manage the rollout of their policies. So it's a way, not the only way.
Yeah. The one like operational benefit I could see of using Helm versus other solutions like Customize or just kubectl apply would be Helm might have a mechanism for waiting for the constraint template to be ingested before applying a constraint. So it could be used as like a shim. If something like Argo CD still doesn't have a mechanism to do something like that. Beyond that, it does seem to me more like porcelain to just kind of like adapt how the thing is configured, right? Instead of writing the values in KRM, they're just writing the same values but in Helm chart format. And as I said, as written, there actually is some loss of fidelity here, right? Like there's no way, if I was writing raw KRM, I could have multiple constraints. With this, we're limited to one. There's ways of writing the chart that fix that, right? So it's not an insurmountable thing. That's just not in there yet. I mean, I would have a hard time objecting to someone put it into contrib for sure. It would make it, if I was to put my hat on as someone like trying to submit this thing, how do you keep contrib up to date? Who owns contrib?
But that's the same question for if it lives in Gatekeeper library too, right? Who is going to continue to maintain it and keep it up to date?
Yeah, you could, like, the way things are written right now, it could be auto-generated. I'm not saying, and by the way, I'm not trying to like argue for the Helm chart. I'm just playing devil's advocate. You could automate it, right? Like this feels like kind of the same sort of thing as our generation of documentation, right? Where you can iterate over the parameters of a constraint to generate the Helm chart and have like a standard template for the things everything has in common, like metadata and match criteria, that kind of thing. That's another thing this isn't supporting is custom match criteria, it looks like.
It seems like it's creating the constraint set template CRDs itself, or am I missing something? No,
Yeah, I think there might be some problems with this PR as is if we were behind the notion. Like, I do kind of remember seeing templates being under CRDs, though maybe not. Maybe that's changed. I don't know. But there's also just the chart templates, right? So it's kind of an overloaded term right now, and I'm looking specifically at. Let's see, is there? Yeah, I think I can copy this. That file while I'm trying to like analyze things, and so that looks like a Helm chart template for a constraint. And
yeah, how does it know that it already had the thing generated, right? Otherwise, it's just going to be like validation failure.
Right. And I don't know Helm like super well, like in terms of its non-declarative bits. I think you could do like a pre-install step, right? And it would wait for the pre-install to complete. So there's, I
Yeah, I don't
think,
think this does that though.
right.
The chart doesn't include that. It will just get installed all at the same time and then it's gonna error out.
All right, so you could wrap it in a retry loop, and eventually it would succeed, hopefully. Or you have a bug.
Yes, there are ways you could do that in Helm to make it like a dependency of something. But
yeah, I guess we've sort of muddled the conversation between could, should, and how. I don't know.
And also I don't think they addressed my question as far as like how do you version the Helm chart, because we're gonna rev each individual template, right? Every time we make a change, how does that impact this one giant Helm chart? And then I think the original issue, someone replied with like, oh, we could just take the max version of a chain as the chart version, which I don't know if that makes sense. Like bump all policies to the same version. I don't know if I like that.
Yeah, you could get some
Really
weirdness.
wonky. Yeah.
Yeah, like if I, in my ideal end state, there'd be some sort of command similar to like go mod or was it pip for Python, where you can scan the constraints, right, and see which templates they require. The constraints will probably have to have some like version information embedded in them, and you could do sort of a dynamic get, so it's pretty easy to blend versions. At that point, the dynamicity of versioning is at the template level. I don't know what the timeline for something like that would be. It's certainly not something we're working on now.
I'm gonna put this here just for funsies.
Caverno has a Helm chart
For
for
the
installing.
PSP stuff, I think. Yeah.
This is what I was saying with the baseline and restricted. I think this makes sense
This
because those
makes
are more
sense.
like opinionated sort of stuff.
Right. But again, if we decide to do this, we have to maintain the chart, you know.
I mean, I think it, like we were saying, it would be like need to be auto-generated.
Right. Like
So
let's
if we would do the same maintenance, we would to the templates, and then the chart will automatically be generated. But obviously, that doesn't answer the question like the versioning and whatnot.
yeah.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, look, I want to see how they do this.
And the chart will still need to be maintained at some level, right? People will have feature requests. We'll do some sort of like upgrade, presumably, that has some new features at some point that we'll need to leverage. It's not that automation is a one and done proposition. Also,
right. I'm sure people are going to add like some values things, like for like exam namespaces and like anywhere that can be customizable. I expect people to add things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, and also the entropy, right? The not entropy. What's the other? Sorry, my brain is slow right now. Inertia. Like just having more stuff that gets generated from the templates and whatnot. The cost is if we make changes to the library, now those changes make changes down the line. Now those changes are more expensive. So it's not, that's another way it's not free. Anyway, just generally, I'm sensing kind of ambivalence. Is that ambivalence to, I would say, caution, like not wanting to just sort of say yes to it without some sort of insulating mechanism so that we're not on the hook for it if it doesn't work as well as hoped.
So if we were, I mean, just for funsies, right? If we were to do something for the pod security standard profile stuff, then it would include the constraints, right?
Yeah, because those are like predefined.
Right. And
Yeah.
are we okay with that?
Yeah, I'm okay with that part of it. Yeah, like
Okay.
more like prescriptive instead of like having everything in there.
Right.
For something like pod security standards, I think it makes sense. Yeah.
And it could be that you basically say in values, you just want like restricted true or whatever, and it deploys all of it. Assuming we can get around like the how does the constraint wait until the CTCRD is available, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And it would need some way to handle multiple instances of PSP, right? Like we wouldn't want to lock ourselves into one instance for the whole cluster. And if we said, well, you could have multiple Helm charts, multiple instances of the same Helm chart, well, then the templates are kind of a shared dependency across those charts. So that would be difficult. So that, to my mind, kind of leaves chart parameters being clever without.
What do you mean as multiple instances, Max?
So like, let's say you want Cube System to have some level of enforcement, but you only want it to warn. You want to have your user-facing namespaces have really locked down privileges, right? Like the namespaces that run web hosts. And then let's say you have some namespaces that run legacy infrastructure where you have certain exceptions, right? So you run like a lower baseline and then maybe add some extra policies on the side to to be as secure as you can. Does that make sense?
So like namespace level, like parameters, sort of, in a way.
Yeah, like PSA, right? You can choose if you're doing like a low, medium, or high level of restriction just by, I forget if it's a label or an annotation on the namespace, right?
Right. So it's basically like multiple constraints, but same template.
Right.
Right. But like, how do you manage the charts in such a way that
I think the can Helm charts have like mapped sort of way? It could be like Cube System deny, I don't know, my namespace dry run.
Like if you just had if you just turned values into a list, right, or had a list underneath values, I should say, and then you put match criteria and whatever other customizations as entries in that list, and it just like stamped it out one set of constraints per list entry. You could put low, medium, high in as a parameter too. Then you would kind of get the same behavior in one Helm chart.
right? So the constraint is doing the different profiles based on, say, namespaces. And that is driven by the Helm value YAML. But it would still be one chart driving the changes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
The thing I don't like about that would just be what it tees users up for, right? Like, so let's say this is a funnel, right? So this is meant to be the first engagement. They take the Helm chart and they install their PSS template, right? And then they decide later on, well, this is good. PSS chart. And later on, they decide, well, this is good. I would also like, let's say, some networking stuff, right? And let's pretend they go to a different Helm chart, right? Or let's say they want to use the library directly, right? Now this one chart has an opinion on constraint templates, right? If the second chart has an opinion on the same constraint templates, right? Or they modify those underlying constraint templates directly. It's not gonna. Was it?
They're gonna fight. They're gonna overwrite. The latest deployment could be overriding because the template is a global thing. Could be.
Yeah, does Helm act as a controller? Does it insistently reconcile, or will it just fight anytime someone runs the Helm command?
It depends on where you deploy the resource to, right? I mean, if for constraint templates, this is all global, right? If it's just like, say, a pod or whatever, like, or say even some config map, as long as you keep it in different namespaces, of course, they won't fight, right?
Well, sorry. What I'm asking is like, so a controller fight. The controllers, you have two controllers that are like always watching and reconciling. So they like fight, right? I thought, and maybe I'm wrong here. Helm only asserts its intent every time the Helm command is invoked, right? Which could be by something that is continuous, like Argo or something like that, or it could be manual. Is I'm not saying that improves things. I'm just trying to understand the stakes.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, because that would be kind of like it's bad either it's like a slow burn, right? And everything looks fine until the Helm command is run again, and then everything breaks, or everything breaks immediately. I'm not sure which is worse. Yeah, anyway, that would be my concern with using Helm charts out of the box. Like Helm just really does not have a good model for shared dependencies, as far as I know. Someone please correct me if that's not true.
Just a quick time check. So to close this, do we want to like reject this? Do we want to like make this like more manageable size with just like the PSS maybe? What is the reply we should go back to the other bit?
My instinct is no. I'd be curious to hear Andrew's thoughts. My other thing is if it's yes, because of that like Helm chart conflict story. Like I agree with you, Sertash, about it being a better UX if it's like a focused thing. But like the day two story is awkward if that's how it's engaged with. So I do think Helm chart is kind of like an all or nothing proposition until they get better at managing shared dependencies like CRDs.
I mean, if we want to, I think we could structure the Helm chart such that the CRDs get deployed first. That is possible.
Right,
yeah.
sorry, go
ahead. Like you said, there are different problems that we're trying to solve with this particular PR. I think maybe first let's, do we want like a PSS type of thing for people?
Right, and my day two objection to that would be, okay, what I just said a few minutes ago about what happens then if people want to install something in addition to PSS, right? The controller fight style problem.
Do you mean if, let's say, I deploy, I don't know, like say, what's one of the PSPs? Disallow capabilities. Let's say I install that constraint template like after the chart is already installed, right? You're saying how is that going to impact the constraint template?
Yeah, and to ground it a little more, I'll switch it to disallow host ports.
Okay.
So yeah, they install it. The PSP or PSS one, it sets some expectation for disallow host ports. Then they decide they want to install some networking policy, right? That also has disallow host ports because networking, and which one wins if they disagree as to which constraint template should be backing disallowed host ports.
I guess like I will argue that's not a regression, right?
Yeah.
Even without Helm chart, this is the case today, right? Multiple constraints could have inadvertent effect if you're not aware.
Right.
of each
Well,
other.
the difference is that now we have a Helm chart wrapping everything, right? Like
Right.
currently there's no packaging or bundling solution that we have, right? So, I'm not saying it's great, but right now it's sort of the user's role to
Figure it
sort
out.
that out. Yeah. Whereas if we wrap it in the Helm chart, right, the promise of Helm is, hey, this just works, right? And so if we have a Helm chart for networking and we have a Helm chart for PSP and they conflict, right? Now, what solution does Helm have? Or what can we offer via Helm or whatever because these things conflict?
I see your concern. I think we could remediate that by having clear documentation in the Helm chart to say like, hey, anything installed outside of Helm is obviously could impact the resources that were managed by Helm, right? Because it's a shared platform.
Right. But let's say both of these are Helm charts.
Mhm.
That's still managed within Helm.
Right. I totally agree with you, the use case. I'm just saying I don't think this is a problem introduced necessarily by Helm. I think it's just the nature of deploying resources in a shared environment.
Right. And what I'm saying is that Helm has no solution for that problem, that conflict problem, right? And so if we embrace Helm as a model of delivery, we're implicitly embracing that problem versus trying to find some method where that solution is tractable. Like right now, because nothing is wrapped in a Helm chart, the problem is like tractable in the sense that a user can select a common version of constraint template, right? If a user has already bought into a Helm workflow and they hit this issue, I don't know what the solution would be other than, well, you need to stop using Helm, right? Which to me would be kind of frustrating, right? Because they've built their infrastructure around this sort of false promise. Or false promise. We force them into a false start. Forced is the wrong word. Led.
That seems like a kind of niche use case, though.
Which networking policies?
Like us having multiple sort of Helm charts for these policies and have them conflicting. Like we would add a note or some place that, hey, these policies are conflicting or something.
I mean, I don't think a PSS policy is niche. I don't think a networking policy is niche.
No, as in like we would offer multiple Helm charts. Like we can't even get one right now.
Okay, yeah, but so are we the only ones ever offering Helm charts, right? And if a user uses our Helm chart, right, are they going to build
But we're
their
not
own?
responsible for that, right? It could be that users can use our existing library, like validation policies that we provide as like a more prescriptive things, and that could conflict with something else.
Right. I think there's a fundamental like problem here that is, as I said before, kind of like the solution pattern in other spaces has been things like go mod, right? Go dep, right? Sorry, go mod or pip, where you're able to dynamically pull stuff in, right? And that handles multi-vendoring and cross dependencies relatively well, right? And then it's sort of on us to like version templates in a way that things are resolvable, backwards compatibility guarantees, all that. Helm can make that impossible, right? Because the granularity isn't there, right? You're installing templates, like a big old batch of templates. And it's as an atomic group, you can't pierce that, right? It's wrapped in the chart. So
I guess do we have an alternative that if not Helm, is there something else?
Well, okay, so it's funny, we've sort of gone from, well, I don't know if I even see much of a use for this, to do we have an alternative for this? So I think the first question would be, do we need an alternative in the short term? In the long term, uh, I I point to the Go mod style of like dependency resolution, right? Give me your constraints. I will figure out which templates match those constraints.
Well, I mean, I didn't want to create a giant Helm chart that deploys everything, but I can see the value of like a PSS Helm chart, especially because of the different profiles, like baseline, restricted, and all that. So I'm just curious if we could potentially work with this PR owner to scope the PR down to something that is a little bit that is valuable, but also not trying to boil the ocean. And to your point about the concerns, you know, with proper documentation, is that good enough? Meaning you know these risks going into using it, and if you still choose to use it because you buy into the nice user experience, and then you use it at your own risk, right? But again, it's it's the value versus the work conversation.
Right. And I just, if someone like asked me, should I use this? Right. Let's assume this chart existed and I was consulting them, I would say no. And that's where I'm like, well, maybe it shouldn't exist then. If I wouldn't recommend people to use it. If we're fine with the sort of like negative impacts that are very real and will like manifest eventually, right? It's like a success problem, but it is a real problem that will limit adoption, right? Like basically it puts a hard cap on how deep someone can engage with Gatekeeper. Then sure, there's other ways of viewing the trade-offs, right? Advertising, ease of use, people's preferred first interaction with the project. I just personally wouldn't because I see all of the downsides.
I mean, this issue's been open since what, 2021? I don't know. Like there are people asking, but obviously I don't think it's like I didn't see that many thumbs ups. And I guess like on some level, we have made it easier, right? We do have the templates and the constraints for people to go create their own charts if they want to. Yeah. Well, that's why I was saying, like, if they really wanted to, and since they did the work, maybe we could suggest, like, hey, would you be interested in putting this in like Contrib so that other people who need it can use it, right? But it's not something that the Gatekeeper project will continue to maintain because of X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah, like my concern would be blessing it, knowing that there's these issues, not the idea that Helm charts that wrap constraints and templates exist as a concept.
Right. Like of course, anyone can go to create it, right? Anyone can do it that way, but it's like, should you do it that way? And how does it impact you in production going forward is kind of the blocker, I guess, or like the concerns. Right. So what do you think?
Oh, good.
Should we maybe point them to Contrib? I definitely don't want to just like shut it down completely because they spend time working on it and I feel bad, right? And I
Yeah.
do think people could use it. It's, I don't know.
I actually do hate saying no. I have no objections to contrib for sure.
Maybe, and just for like sake of making it easier for people, maybe in Gatekeeper, you know how for the PSP stuff, we like you have examples, right? Should we maybe like do the examples based on the different profile levels, like baseline, restricted?
Yeah, I kind of thought we had that, but I guess we
I
didn't.
thought so too.
I think we talked about it in the past, but we never did. Yeah.
Oh, we never did. Okay. So maybe that's helpful, right?
We should definitely have that. Yeah.
Okay. So like, you know how today we have validation PSP. So maybe we group them. Sorry, not group them. The templates are still on their own, but like the examples maybe have different levels, right? Okay. So maybe that's something that came out of this conversation.
But does that relate to the Helm chart or is like separate?
It's a separate thing. I'm just trying to figure out like, can we meet halfway kind of thing.
But it sounds like they just want the Helm chart. That's the
I know.
Yeah.
But I don't think that giant Helm chart is sustainable either.
Yeah. And then it sounds like Max, you're on the no side for just any sort of Helm chart. Is that right?
Yeah. And my field giant is more tractable than purpose, but neither.
Yeah, even like the most minimal Helm chart, you're against it.
Yeah, minimal I think has worse day 2 issues.
Yeah, minimal. Let's just quantify as like just like the PSS stuff.
Yeah.
I'm capturing some notes in the.
Yeah, and then I think I suggested like a CLI in the issue, like a sort of like a brew crew sort of deal. And then I think one of the people in the issue said the CLI would be harder to manage in like a CI/CD systems. I'm assuming the users are using these as part of like Terraform or some other system.
Which is kind of confusing. Like, aren't they meant to string together commands?
Yeah, so I think they use these as like to deploy using Terraform. So they basically just take like the templates and customize like the values in the Terraform release.
Right, and Terraform has a Helm.
Yeah, they have a Helm provider sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think so I think some of them we need to view in that sort of lens. Because even if we wanted our own sort of Gator deploy whatever, right? It may not be so much useful because they do deploy using the Helm release.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the problem here is the templates, right? Which is analogous to the CRD problem, which Helm has no solution for, which really irks me that they've like pushed that on individual repositories to sort of solve in their own way. If there's a way to handle, if Helm develops a way to handle shared dependencies, this becomes tractable. Or if we develop, as I said, this lookup commands, you could use the Helm chart to generate the constraints. You would still need some post-processing to then inject the templates in. That could be another way of solving it. I don't know how well that would play with something like Terraform, right? Like I don't know how much post-processing stuff it lets you do. Though using Terraform, good.
You could potentially, I'm just brainstorming here, like maybe like 2 Helm charts, one for the templates and then one for the constraints. And then make sure that the template stuff is a dependency for the constraints chart, such that you make sure the templates get installed and managed prior to doing anything with the constraints.
Yeah, that works. Oh, good. That works if you can control the versioning, right? Like if you could get like a high watermark version for the template chart, right? And this is basically what someone was saying of use the most recent template version as the version of the template chart. And then also the constraints express their dependency requirements with respect to that high watermark. That can work. It does assume we own the entire universe of templates and constraint templates. So if a user wants to roll their own, that gets a little complicated, but yeah, that's more tractable to me.
Okay, so for the PR next steps, I guess like Sertaj, do you want to work with the PR owner to see if they want to move it to contrib?
Yeah, so it sounds like that's the thing. So we're basically rejecting on library, but they should do a PR on the contrib.
Right, and I'm still like, and even if they were to do it in contrib, I mean, I guess like at that point they could do whatever they want, but I'm still kind of like against a big giant Helm chart for all the policies. But again, since anyone can put stuff in contrib, I guess like I don't know what kind of enforcements we can apply there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's also going to get massively out of sync probably
Very, as soon as it's merged, right? It's out of date.
Unless they made their own sort of CI in contrib, I don't know if that exists to auto sync that sort of stuff.
Like, yeah, they could probably build their own if they wanted to. But I think the other good thing about this is we would get a sense of usage patterns, right? Like we would assume we wanted to adopt it. I think we would feel a lot more comfortable doing so, knowing what kinds of improvements people want over time, right? And knowing the usage patterns.
Okay, and then for PSS for gatekeeper policies, I added a bullet point for provide examples for each profile level.
Yeah, I think I have an issue for that. I'll link.
I guess it's interesting, like since Kyvernal has the Helm charts, like I wonder how people use that chart, especially like they're doing deployments of policies outside of the Helm chart lifecycle.
Well, Kyvernal is self-contained, right? Like the policy is the code in Kyvernal, so they don't have the shared dependency problem. Something like validating admission policy, on the other hand, would have that. So that would be interesting.
But even their policy, right? It's a YAML. In theory, they could someone, right? A dev could go update deployment of that particular policy YAML outside of the Helm chart, and now the Helm chart release is out of sync. That's all. That could always happen.
Yeah, I mean, there though, it's so for Gatekeeper, kind of the problem would be like in the bounds of the Helm chart, right? You have a constraint and a constraint template, and then outside of it, you have like a different constraint that refers to the constraint template, right? And so the template is like necessarily in conflict. With Caverno, you would have policy that is, I'm trying to stay in the camera, policy that is self-contained, right? And then a different policy that is self-contained, right? So as long as they don't name them the same thing, there's no conflict. So it's a little bit more tractable. Did we want to talk about the the multiple pods stuff? Like I kind of said, the analysis on the issue, or my analysis on the issue. I'm curious if there are questions about it.
Yeah, I actually read that and I understood what you were saying. So I just wanted to see what other folks also think about that analysis. And I was just curious because I think there is one more advantage to splitting about it, which is reduced audit times as well, which I forgot to mention on the issue, and was curious if people like have had chance to look at it, look at the issue, look at your comments, and had any other thoughts.
Yeah, reduced audit times color me doubtful there, just because of throttling. Like if you hit throttling, you'll get potentially increased audit times. It could be you are running like so the expensive bit for audit could be sending the requests, or it could be evaluating them, right? If it's evaluation, throwing more CPU at the problem could definitely improve audit times. That being said, my first approach there would be to just increase the amount of CPU to the audit pod and running evaluations in parallel. That's a little simpler to do infrastructurally speaking. That would help with the execution time, not necessarily with the retrieval time, because that would still be done in sequence. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I think your feedback on the issue is legitimate, and those things I hadn't thought of. So I'm curious if I should keep it open and close it. What should I do?
I mean, you saw is pretty strongly like you're gonna get a lot of complexity for maybe even negative value with it. There were some like assumptions in there around like throttling will happen, for instance, that facts not in evidence. I just know the API server does do that, and for larger clusters, it's more likely to happen, right? Because you're sending more requests. I think there's definitely work that can be done on audit just generally, right? Like streamlining the code base a little bit could be good. Having the ability to have multi-threading could be good. One thing that could be cool that is sort of like counter to what you were saying is actually if we spread the workload more evenly, that could be cool, right? Because right now audit is spiky. It's like, oh, audit's happening. Let me work as hard as I can to deliver the results as fast as I can. And so there's like a compression of all the requests to the K8s API server toward the start of audit, right? And then all of the CPU being used to perform those audit results, and then it just goes dormant again. And I think there's a use case for spreading that out, right? Because you're less likely to hit throttling if you have higher or lower QPS peaks and wider QPS. It's over a longer time duration, and you could also potentially lower CPU usage. Maybe not, because CPU is kind of greedy anyway. But you could maybe get away with allocating less CPU to the pod for equivalent results. The downside of that would be then like the tuning becomes harder, right? Like if you're auditing, let's say every day, right, and you're intentionally trying to make audit happen over the majority of that time period, that's a pretty delicate balance, right? And so that would require some pretty high user involvement.
Yeah. I guess I'm still confused about how you would distribute it for a longer period of time, but never mind. I mean, I don't, seems like it's something that might be not, that we might not need. So
Yeah, so well, the need would be to lessen the main benefit, honestly, would be lessening the burden on the API server, which is a pretty significant potential benefit. The easy way to do it, and I forget if the code is already structured like this or not, would be to scrape one GVK, run audit on that GVK, then scrape the next one, right? So at least you're staggering IO intensive, compute intensive, IO intensive, compute intensive.
I think,
Good.
yeah, I think it's different. I think we write everything on the disk first and then evaluate everything together rather
Yeah.
than what you said.
Yeah, so that would be a pretty cheap and easy way of spreading out the QPS a little bit. Beyond that, then you start to get into stuff that probably users would want to tune, right? Things like adding sleeps in between, like add GVK, audit GVK, sleep for, I don't know, 10 minutes, and then audit the next one. But how long should you sleep for? Great question. Depends on how long your policy takes to evaluate, how many resources you have, what's your audit cycle, and all of those are very fact-specific considerations, and different users will have different answers.
Yeah. Cool. I don't think, and I guess I had one more question. Is there any other real way to split up audit than GVK based? Like
Across pods, you're saying?
Yeah, if there would be. I'm just curious.
I think our problem there is the API, the K8s API server surface, right? Like, if you wanted to do it by, well, let's try by namespace, right? What you would wind up having, and maybe I'm over focusing on request count here, maybe not. You would still do a list call per GVK, but you would also multiply that by the number of namespaces, right? So for getting pods, and you had namespace A, B, and C, it would go from kubectl get pods to kubectl get pods namespace A, get pods namespace B, get pods namespace C. And so my question would be, is that more or less expensive from the API server's view? I think more expensive because etcd would need to do multiple indexes, right? And it would need to, I don't know, indexes is the right word, but it would need to scan through pods multiple times, and it would need to have multiple state tokens, right, for resumption of lists. I don't know what the cost of maintaining those pagination tokens is. I'm guessing not zero, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And then any other way you could choose to break it down will still have that downside, right? Because the K8s API server is, or the API surface is naturally broken down by technically resource, but essentially kind.
Yeah, I think I got the answers I needed. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm
Like,
still not sure what to do with this issue, so I'll keep it around for a while or let it go to stale. And if folks have any thoughts even after this discussion,
well,
it'd
I'm curious.
be
Sorry, I'm curious for the motivation of the issue, right? Is there a specific
so
thing?
a couple of things. Like first one, the issue that Unlearn and I were investigating a while back, where there was a IO throttling, and we asked the same question on a change, and you replied there with the comment that if this happens in the first place, then it's not like IO throttling issue, rather resource issue, and there are not enough resources for the cluster for audit pod to write that heavily. I don't know if you remember or not. I just provided a little bit of context there. So that was the first.
Sorry, let me stop you. When you say IO throttling, do you mean IO reading and writing to and from disk, or do you mean
So there was an issue where audit was writing extensively on the disk, and because of that, audit cycles were like huge, and audit pod was crashing, and essentially there was no audit happening. And this was one of the motivation that maybe splitting up audit can help with that issue. The second one was reduced audit time, because within the same issue, I noticed that like audit times were 4-5 hours when it was configured to be half an hour. Audit interval was configured to be half an hour. So that was another motivation. And the third one, as I understood, first audit. I don't know the exact reason, but as I understood it, since we were reporting everything on constraint, there was no real way, since audit reports were posted on constraint, there was not a way to split up audit that would introduce conflicts on writing on the constraint. So that's why audit pod was kept to one. But now with PubSub and other exploration, maybe we can divide. So that was the motivation.
I see. So you would essentially, for that last point, need to disable writing to constraints at all. Okay. So we're sort of looking at an optional kind of like situation where the user is disabling this one feature knowingly so they could get more surface.
Yeah.
My first instinct would be, because networking is usually more expensive than disk, would my first instinct would be like, what kind of disk, like what IOPS does it support, right? Because if reading and writing to and from it is kind of the throttle here, changing style of disk could help. obviously RAM disks have great performance, but then you're going to need the RAM to support that RAM disk. Using SSD backed could be helpful. If we're still talking plattered stuff, being able to distribute across multiple disks, though that's starting to get kind of fancy, right? In terms of both how do you specify the pod, right? And how do you configure Gatekeeper to distribute the load across disks, right? Which would be kind of icky. I do think that disk is one of those things, though, that multiple pods could be helpful for if there's a distribution across physical machines, right? So and disk is kind of like a vague term, right? Are you talking about like a NetApp filer, right? Is that your actual disk, or is it a spinning hard drive that's on the machine, right? If it's a spinning hard drive, if you're running 5 pods, let's say 5 audit pods, they should be running on different machines. Otherwise, they're gonna like all hit the same hard drive, only more randomly. So you'll actually like hurt performance because spinning hard drives random IO is much less performant than sequential. Yeah. So there might be some there. But my first plan of attack, as I said, would be to try to find more performant storage.
Yeah.
Without knowing what the storage was, I couldn't tell you how easy or hard or reasonable that suggestion is.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know. Then the action item would be to look into audit to see if we can adapt the suggestions that we just discussed, like going GVK by GVK, and that I think will help reduce the load on API server as well as on disk throttling, because it certainly takes time to evaluate every GVK.
Yeah, another thing we might look at is how are the files persisted. If I remember right, it's like a file per object.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of weak on this point. So I think it's the case that if you're writing out separate files, you're sort of guaranteeing random IO, right? Where kind of what you want to do is grab hold of the disk and use it for as long as possible, right? And read sequentially from a file. Old school databases were really great at that. and I don't know how, other than like, Postgres's wall logs, right? Those are like a big old file that it would just like append to. And you would make sure that your other IO would happen on a different disk, so that the writing of the wall logs got as much sequential time as possible. So it could be that changing our file system model could, for the spinning disk use case, help here. SSDs still, I think, a performance benefit, but less. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can't really know for sure that which kind of disk is going to be used, right? So we can't assume one to be the case and implement that way. That might end up hurting the other.
Oh, I don't think there's any downsides in changing the granularity of the file size.
Okay.
Other than like having a large file, like you're still the net amount of storage used should still be the same, or the peak storage used should still be the same. And if you're using like what it would do is the operating system would be handling sort of the load balancing between it, but you would be a bit more greedy, right? Saying like, no, I'm not done writing this file versus write or read small file 1, read small file 2.
Yeah.
You also might start using less actual space on disk because of block sizes. That's not a huge concern, I don't think. I don't think the stuff is that big.
I don't recall though right now if we write one list call in one file, or we distribute one list call, split it up to one object and then write it on different files. So that I need to check. But if that's the case, sounds like writing one list call in one file could be another improvement that we can look at.
Yeah, I would definitely though check my work on that. This is how this actually works with operating systems, because this is like 80% speculation, 20%, kind of knowing how old school databases work.
And so I'm curious about why, and if you recall it, and I know we are way over time, so we can do it in the next week as well. But just a question, that why was the approach that you suggested, that we retrieve one GVK and evaluate policies, then we retrieve another GVK, evaluate policies, was not taken in the first place?
Path of least resistance, I think. Like audit originally existed. Like the first incarnation of audit was audit from cache, right? Like everything basically, if it was cached in OPA, you would call audit. There's like an audit hook that you could call in the constraint framework, and that would audit from OPA. That had some downsides in that you needed to sync everything you audited, right? Which is kind of a memory hog in a lot of cases. But did mean you didn't need to query the API server. So what we moved to was an audit that scraped the API server, right? And that's kind of what you see, which is you use the discovery API, and then per kind, you run a list. And the downside of that was that was still the memory usage growth. Like if you have 10 billion pods on a cluster and you list pods, right, you're gonna need 10 billion enough memory to store 10 billion pods. And so the idea was, well, we can paginate lists, right? Because Kubernetes allows you to list in chunks. And then you don't necessarily need to have enough RAM to store 10 billion pods. You could store like 1,000 or whatever. And you have a hard cap on memory usage. The downside to that, though, is that the API server has a cap on how long you can resume lists for, right? I forget the actual timeframes, if there's a guaranteed minimum, or if like you can always roll off if there's too much activity happening on the API server. It's basically the same consideration as watch resumption. The etcd tries to maintain enough state to resume watches, but eventually that state is gone. And so we needed to list this stuff as fast as possible, right? But that's a catch-22, right? If you wanted to store everything in RAM, then you're back where you started, right?
Yeah.
Except now you're running more API queries or
Yeah.
more queries, and you've added this resumption
Yeah.
risk. So we spool it to disk under the assumption that that would be faster than auditing, like evaluating the constraint templates or the constraints, which is maybe not accurate, right? That could be another performance gain, is don't spool to disk, just immediately evaluate. It will have some breaking behavior potentially, right? Like some of this is also users having these knobs allows users to choose a failure behavior, and that can be kind of like a complex calculus. So there's a balancing act there. But yeah, so anyway, what we did was we would spool each chunk to disk, then read it out. And as to why it was like do all of the writing to disk and then the other behavior, one, it might not be. Like I'm kind of struggling and thinking maybe it was written a different way, because I seem to remember the disk overriding itself, right? And that would only make sense if it evaluated, if it staggered scrape, evaluate, scrape, evaluate.
So I think after the data that we get with the size of audit chunk, we evaluate, and then we come back, we delete everything, and then get the next data for the size of audit chunk, and then we evaluate that data again. So that's how the behavior is right now. So,
I'm pretty sure we don't evaluate between chunks. I think you mean once we've gathered, excuse me, an entire list.
Yeah. I think
Okay.
that's
All right, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's the behavior. We make calls list chunk by chunk, and then we store everything. We go, and then for the next audit run, we delete everything and start again.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm a little hazy on the specifics of the code, but it would be for historical reasons, plus people just not having the thought, right? Like, okay, it worked fine before, so we're just going to make incremental changes, right? And unfortunately, that's organic growth, right? Like when you code without looking at the overall principle, you sort of get not necessarily spaghetti code, but just results that don't make sense with the use case, but make sense with the history of the code. It's kind of always unavoidable at some level, but it's always good to, every once in a while go to 10,000 feet and see if something can be improved.
Yeah, cool. So the takeaway is look at audit code and see if what we discussed right now can be applied to it to make some changes. There are some assumptions, and I don't even know how to prove if if we made those changes, we would definitely improve or not. So we can discuss it later someday. But yeah, that sounds like that's what we are leading towards.
If it is not staggered, staggering it is a very safe change that will definitely not have a downside other than the inherent risks of any code change. And
what do you mean by staggered?
Scrape, audit, scrape, audit, scrape, audit.
Your voice
kind.
Or my internet went off. I don't
know. Can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Staggered is per GVK, scrape, audit, scrape, audit, scrape, audit, scrape, audit.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That we're not doing anything new. We're just resequencing and kind of like load balancing.
Yeah.
This all the other stuff I'm talking about is predicated on, for instance, switching to large files is predicated on my speculation on how the I/O load balancing stuff works. So check that before you spend too
Your
much
voice is
time.
gone again.
What's that?
Your voice is gone again. I can't
Oh
hear you.
no! Can you hear me now? Test, making sounds, making more sounds. Nope.
Now I can.
Okay. Yeah, for the audit or for the using just a large file written to sequentially, double check what I'm saying makes sense, and or if it's cheap to do, just run some tests, right? Do it and see if it yields improvements on a machine with spinning disks. And then some of this other stuff, like, is it worth looking at multiple pods specifically for the disk problem, or having a more complex configuration surface for interacting with disks, right? Like spreading your writes across multiple disks. Whether that makes sense, that would be something I would defer until we knew like the usefulness of this. And probably that would be weighed against like just infrastructure realities, right? Like what's the cost and how common is something like using a filer for people where you can get scalable IO, right? Presumably clouds like EBS type stuff, extensible block storage, I think is really just like virtual disks on a filer. If that's common enough, that might just be the answer. Because throwing programmatic complexity at it is only useful if it lets people do things more cheaply, right, than they otherwise would have, and that cost savings is worth the effort of development, the effort of the user maintaining that complexity, so on.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks for your thoughts. I learned something new today.
Sorry, they're wordy thoughts.
It's all right. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good talking with you.